This is Reimagining Higher Education, your go-to podcast with remarkable education leaders sharing personal stories from their experience in and around the sector, including reflection and hope for progress in the sector. With your host, Professor Judyth Sachs, former PVC Learning and Teaching at the University of Sydney, Deputy Vice-Chancellor and Provost at Macquarie University, and Special Advisor in Higher Education at KPMG, and now Chief Academic Officer at Studiosity. Welcome.
It gives me great pleasure to talk to the Vice-Chancellor of Victoria University of Wellington, Professor Nic Smith. Nic, I'm not going to describe your journey as a leader and a learner. I'll throw that to you, but you are the Vice-Chancellor of Victoria University, and in fact, you've just celebrated the beginning of your second year in role.
Yes.
So
yes.
We can talk about that, but what was the object that you brought to represent your journey as a leader and a learner?
Yeah, Judith, I bought a book, which might seem like a somewhat sort of unimaginative choice, given that universities are so full of books. But this particular book is one of my PhD students' thesis. And when you suggested I bring somebody, I sort of looked at all my things and all of the thesis, and I could have chosen probably any one of them because they all have a story and a connection. And I have loved the almost 30 students who I have been able to supervise in their PhDs. But this particular thesis was actually outside my direct academic field, which was in biomedical engineering and heart disease. It was in cancer. And it was the student, Haley was a student of mine who I supervised her honours project as an undergraduate. And during that time, her younger brother was dying of cancer. And so it had a huge personal meaning for her. But it was also a piece of work which she, did the kind of things which is wonderful in research. She sort of lost herself in that research and found really new ways of seeing information and really new ways of being able to diagnose, particularly melanoma in that space. And, as a Vice-Chancellor, I get this opportunity as well, but I got to sort of live vicariously through her enthusiasm and her research and her achievements. It ultimately produced a whole number of papers, which had quite profound implications for people who were very sick and also for people who had the potential to become very sick. And it remains, like all of my research students, one of the great experiences and great memories of my time in the university.
Well, let's turn it back to you. And what was your experience like as a student, both as an undergraduate, but then as a graduate student? Because you did your graduate work at Oxford.
I did my postdoctoral fellowship at Oxford, and then I ultimately was a professor at Oxford. But my university experience probably started before many people. My father is a physical sciences academic, and my mother is a humanities and social sciences academic. And so from a very small age, I was sort of taken into universities and taken on field trips. My father is a geologist, and he always had to take rock samples, and they had to have this big, heavy hammer they had to carry to get the rock samples out. And they also had to carry me as a 2 and a 3-year-old, but they wanted to carry the hammer because the hammer didn't ask any questions and didn't talk. So I sort of grew up with these conversations around the dinner table, which would span all of academic, and there were sort of vociferous arguments about all kinds of things, from sort of politics to the meaning of science to the value of insight. And I have to say, when I got to university finally as an undergraduate, I was actually a little disappointed. I felt like I was channeled into a particular specific area of learning, and while I did well, I had lost some of the kind of excitement and imagination. And it wasn't until a few years working when I came back to do my PhD, a bit like my student Haley, I found that kind of love of finding things out and realizing that once you can understand what the literature which is known, once you can move beyond it, you move into this space where you can try things and experiment with things and sometimes fail, but the insights that you get more than compensate for that. And then when I went to Oxford as a postdoctoral fellow, and I was very involved in a number of things, but particularly athletics at Oxford. And running in particular is quite a social sport. You go and meet your friends and you talk as you go. And I had many wonderful friends from that time, and I sort of recaptured that sense of the transdisciplinary discussions that got me excited in the first place. The questions of, how do you balance needs of individuals with needs of groups, or how do you balance important things today with important things in the future? And that experience has probably continued for me. And one of the great indulgences and privileges you get as a university leader is people are prepared to have those conversations with me now. They're prepared to answer what sometimes can be quite ignorant questions, and that what makes my role and my experience in universities a sort of wonderful journey so far.
So what I'm hearing is that in your undergraduate, there was a real lack of curiosity. The pedagogy was about delivering of content rather than delivering of curiosity. And you found that later, and you're applying it now to your role as a Vice-Chancellor as well, in your discussions with people and encouraging it?
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think as an undergraduate, often you are given content and asked to respond to it. And that misses some of the creativity. It misses some of that sense of inquisitive learning where you find your own journey. And, one of the most exciting things, and certainly for me academically, but also now in my role as a leader, is connecting disparate fields together and taking two ways of seeing a common problem and bringing that and being able to go further because of that. And perhaps it was a necessary part of learning that you had to develop the foundation before you could move into that phase. But it's that phase, and I'm probably moving up sort of Bloom's taxonomy as I go, that I find incredibly exciting and really fulfilling. And I think it makes universities such wonderful places.
There's certainly challenging times that we're living in higher education. And I've got some contacts in New Zealand universities as well. And just talking to a couple of them, the change of government has meant a change of priorities, and a change of priorities have implications on resources. What are the challenges that you're managing on a sort of high-level strategic basis, but then on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah, I mean, a day-to-day basis, and I think all Vice-Chancellors would say this, we have a funding crunch, but it doesn't add much for me to just reiterate that. The former very charismatic Prime Minister and David Lange in New Zealand referred to Vice-Chancellors as bikers who wore suits. I think that's often that sense of us turning up and just saying we're not getting enough funding. Strategically, I think there were really fundamental questions of relevance for universities, and I think that's probably true around the world, but certainly in New Zealand. I was reading a few months ago an account of the development of the printing press, the Gutenberg printing press in the mid-1400s. And it was very interesting because on one sense, they were very quickly able to transmit information which had been held in the sort of theological centers of the time very tightly. It was very expensive to distribute because it had to be hand copied, and it had errors that came with those copies. And so they'd sort of got to the point where they couldn't actually distribute anything else. And suddenly this technology came along where it could be done quickly, cheaply, and error-free. And there was this sense that this was going to power the Great Enlightenment. But what it did before that was produce an era of actual intellectual disorientation. Nobody knew whether something was just somebody's opinion or manifesto, or it was cherished information that was really valuable. And you can see the parallels today where we arguably have more information and access to it than we've ever had, yet we're arguably less informed. Mm-hmm. You can see contexts where we are better connected, but actually more lonely. You can see cases where as a society, we have these existential challenges for us all, climate change being just one, and yet we're probably more polarized. And so as a university, I think our role is to take the things that have conferred value in other contexts, but actually reprioritize and rethink about how they're delivered, because we should be the antidote. We should be the force for binding people together, for bringing humility and respect and evidence and understanding. But we can't do it the way we've always done it. We have to do it in different ways. And I think that's a huge challenge and opportunity for us at a strategic level.
Well, when you think of both COVID and then the development of AI in the past 3 years, it really has been an inflection point relating to those things that you mentioned. So from where you sit, particularly around AI, what are you seeing as both the opportunities, but also the pitfalls and the threats?
Yeah, AI is absolutely on that cusp of both opportunity and challenge. And I've read quite a lot in recent times about it. And, personally, part of me wants to go and build a log cabin and run for the hills. And part of me is incredibly excited about what this could mean. I think on the challenge side, there are two things which are kind of fundamental. One is the fact that we are going to embed the biases and prejudices in an even more opaque system than we previously had. And therefore, we're going to be shaped by a technology with less understanding and less ability to be able to manipulate the constituent parts. And I think that's really worrying. If you put into any number of the image generators, show me a surgeon or a judge or an engineer, you disproportionately get white males of a certain. I think that's a really significant issue. I think the other thing from a learning perspective, and this was described to me quite cogently recently by one of our software academics, is that the way most of us have learned up till now is by building a really strong foundation and then using that foundation. Probably I've just been complaining about it in my undergraduate, to, as I've said, move up the kind of learning taxonomies and to move. And then ultimately by doing that, you can bring other information together, you can synthesize, you can analyze, and you can create. And if you can now replace that foundation with an AI, which students can do very easily, then your motivation to develop that foundation is going to be diminished. And your then capacity to move up and do the still uniquely human things that drive us is going to be diminished as well. And so somehow we have to find ways of keeping our abilities to build really strong foundations and then use that to accelerate our capacity, as many of us are doing, using the kind of AI tools to move up and add the value at the top of that particular chain.
So you mentioned Bloom's taxonomy, so the higher order thinking skills.
Yeah.
That's where the emphasis needs to be, sort of critique, synthesis, analysis. And for many students, they don't get taught that at school. They get, I remember teaching first year sociology, and they didn't know how to write essays. They knew how to answer an exam question, but they didn't know how to write essays. So does it require then a completely recalibration of what the focus is, moving away from content to skills to application?
Yeah, it's such an interesting question and such an interesting point. I would argue, yes, it does. I would argue that I learned computational mathematics as an undergraduate, but actually the subsidiary skills of rationalizing uncertainty and navigating complexity, the capacity to communicate complex ideas in terms that were relevant and salient for different audiences. And that is true of whether you are doing mathematics or finance or sociology or history. And in many senses in universities, I think we have, while we've seen our disciplines as primary, actually they have been practice and proving grounds for those higher level skills. Mm-hmm. And, and for the vast majority in the future of work, we're not training people to be in the discipline that they study. We're using that knowledge and that framework to, as you say, buttress and develop and expand those high level skills. And that is one of those examples, I suppose, I was talking about previously, of rethinking about what our value add is and what our relevance is going to be in terms of what our pedagogy and educational experience is.
And do we need to go back and sort of ask some more fundamental questions around assessment? Why do we assess? What do we assess? What do we want to assess? Because at the end of the day, assessment is actually part and parcel of the credential that students receive.
Yeah, at its most base level in universities, we hopefully select people who have talent. We hopefully develop that talent, and then we quality assure that talent. And those three things are inextricably linked. And I think there has not been enough focus on assessment. And most of the institutions I've been in, we've had to work really hard to actually reduce the assessment load and to focus, to your point, on the synthesis of knowledge rather than the mere sort of atomization and ticking off of specific things. Now, most academics, in my experience, intrinsically get that. But I think we still find it hard to let go of the particular thing that we have dedicated our lives to, often to study. I remember one professor telling me that there was, and he wasn't being funny, that you couldn't live a self-actualized life unless you understood partial differential equations. And that was his particular view, and it's funny for everybody else, but I think that view gets repeated, perhaps in not quite stark terms, by many people who have fallen in love with their discipline throughout their careers and really want to impart that to their students in the purest form.
So, talking about disciplines, I mean, I think through our training, and we are trained through our disciplines, and it provides the framework for us to make sense of the world in which we live, but also to make informed decisions. So, your discipline being both engineering and biomedical sciences, how have your two interdisciplinary areas framed how you go about leading, but also how you go about learning?
Yeah, there's always this sort of chicken and egg question in that process. I have at different times sort of railed against people who've said, "Oh, you're an engineer, so you must think like this, or you must think like that." If I'm really honest, I chose engineering in part because through school I had mild dyslexia, and I would avoid writing. I had to write a PhD thesis to get over this. But there are so many sort of disciplinary lenses and ways of reframing things. And one of my favorite things in universities is listening to other people's way of framing things and understanding what that looks like. But to come back to your question, my field has spanned mathematics, which at its core for me is just a language for describing what we see. It's a way of manipulating ideas and connecting them and juxtaposing them. There's a Erwin Schrödinger quote, which I love, and people who don't know, Schrödinger was the nuclear physicist who, along with Einstein and others, was seminal in that particular era. And he wrote a book after he'd done his nuclear physics, because he was sort of reframing himself as a biologist at that point, called What is Life? And in the introduction to What is Life, he says, "We are only now beginning to acquire reliable material of welding together the sum total of all that is known into a whole. But on the other hand, it's impossible for a single mind to command more than a small specialized portion of it." And what mathematics gives you the ability to do is to take different ideas, represent them in mathematics, and then put them together. And so you don't have to think about the entire system all at once. And that is super exciting for things like environmental science, or in my case, sort of physiology of the human body. And so I really enjoyed that process. And then what I was working on was engaging with sort of clinical medicine. So how do we connect that to clinical medicine? And medicine, and I might offend people, but it's not so much a science. It's more of a heuristic exercise of looking at evidence, looking at results, and justifiably so. And so we were able to kind of use these models of how we understood what's going on to actually move beyond the heuristic elements of the discipline and treat patients and give the right treatment to the right patient at the right time, and move beyond the clinical paradigm, which again, one of my close collaborators once said to me, "Look, the only way I know whether what I'm doing is right is I get 500 patients and I treat them one way, and 500 patients and treat them another way, and then I have to wait 5 years and see who's still alive." And so we were able to offer a much better way of making the treatments personalized, predictive, participatory in that space. So if I come now back full circle to the question of what does that mean for my leadership, I always like the process of understanding the whole, and then looking at which parts of the whole are contributing. And then in which cases is it important to have a sort of consistent approach that everyone can understand, that's transparent, and in which cases do we do something which is more specific and personalized. I enjoy the process of framing that in ways that everybody can understand, but ultimately I want people to participate in the process and find their way and their working in that framework.
So let's focus now on students.
Yeah.
What's student life like at VU?
VU is like all universities, has its own flavour. Our students, we're in the heart of the political capital of not only of the country, but it's quite a small capital city.
Mm-hmm.
And so, the politics and the way in which we do business and the governance infuses everything, not just about the university, but the city as a whole. And our students, in many different ways, take advantage of that. We have a highly politicized, highly active, highly articulate, very engaged student body, which I think is really exciting. We have great debates on campus. They're not shy in telling me what they think, and I think that's a good thing as well. And so that's a sort of, and I think it's at its core, there's also a hopeful outlook, a sense of empowerment that actually we need to take some responsibility and we need to make some changes, because there was concerns again about things like climate change and social cohesion and education that come with that. At the same time, I think it's fair to say that our students are now working in paid employment more than they ever have, sometimes 20, 25, 30 hours a week. And there's huge pressure on them in that space. And then there's attendant pressure on them actually being able to come to campus and participate in those events. Post-COVID, there are challenges, and this isn't unique to us, but I think it's right across the sector of students re-engaging in the sort of social life on campus and getting away from just watching the lectures in their bedrooms. And there's, attendant issues as to what they're going to look like in the future of work. We've already mentioned AI. So exciting, political, active, but also facing some very real challenges that certainly our generation didn't have to deal with in that space.
And that being a civic government interfaced university makes you quite different from, say, places like Waikato, Massey, probably even Otago. So how does that then become an attraction point for your students as a sort of a differentiator? Because all of those other universities are fabulous universities. So what's the point of differentiation for Victoria University?
They are fabulous universities, and I think the New Zealand universities sometimes aren't given credit for being as diverse as they are, because there are very distinct strengths, and our unique strength is the city that we're in. And I've worked in Oxford, I've worked in London, Brisbane, Auckland, and I still can't think of a better city to have a university in. We're small enough to have the creative arts, Wellywood as it's sometimes known, a really active entrepreneurial software startup, which we host a huge hub in that space. There's design, there's emerging technology tools, there's wonderful science, but then there is also that governance and the central role of humanities. And I can walk from my office and be in the Prime Minister's office or the Minister of Finance in 10 minutes. And it still shocks me just how direct that engagement is and how interested they are in the ideas that are being generated. So the wonderful thing about Wellington is you have all of that in a small space. You have all of that. You can walk across the city. You can often you walk across, and just by walking to work, and I walk across the city every morning on the way to work, I meet people and have conversations that I never would have had. And they're profound conversations. They're questions around where is the education system in New Zealand going, or how are we going to deal with infrastructure in a long-term space? And that's an ecosystem which our students play a huge part in. And I can't think, perhaps that's true of Canberra at ANU, perhaps that's true of some of the college towns in the US. London was probably too big, and Oxford had a wonderful vibe of its own, but it didn't have that kind of connection to the politics. It's a really great part of being a civic institution and being here at Victoria University of Wellington.
You mentioned that you've worked in the UK, in universities. You've worked in Australia at QUT, 2 institutions in New Zealand. What are the things that, in terms of your formation as a leader, what have you taken from each of those very different contexts and those very different experiences, both in terms of the location, but also the nature of the institution?
Probably lots of different things. And I've had some wonderful mentors at every institution. I can tell you for a great length about the sort of wonderful people I've had to work with. But in different ways, I think the commonality is that universities are hubs and homes for really bright, ambitious, intellectually curious people. And the best thing that I can do, or in my opinion, the best thing I can do, is to give them the kind of stability and confidence and foundation which allows them to go and do the extraordinary things and chase the extraordinary opportunities that they see in front of them. And there's lots of different examples I can think about that in my time, but probably most recently, when I was at QUT, Queensland University of Technology, those who were in Brisbane at the time will remember this, but at the beginning of 2022, we had fairly devastating floods. QUT's right down on the river. And the river rose about 6 meters in about 6 hours. And we were sort of watching and planning. And I remember being in my office and being rung by one of the campus security people. And he said, we're having an infestation of rats coming onto the campus because they're all leaving the riverbank. And I was so far out of my depth. I was like, I know nothing about this. So I don't know how we're going to deal with this. And then about 90 minutes later, he rang me and said, actually, the rats aren't the problem. The problem is that they're being chased by the snakes. And then it wasn't very much longer after that, he rang me a third time. He said, look, I'm really sorry, and this is completely unrelated, but we've had a power crisis and we've got 185 cadavers which are thawing out. And it's very easy in that situation as a leader to think, this is a really uncomfortable place that I'm like everybody, I'm just looking for the certainty and a foundation from which to decide to move forward from. But Margaret Shield, who was VC and a wonderful mentor of mine, and Leanne Harvey, who's I still think the best registrar I've ever worked with, got together and we said, actually, our role is to buffer the wider community from these things. Our role at times when people are worrying about their family and their homes and their house is to give them clarity and security, and not to sort of look to optimize a response. And so their big question was, we have all that, we've left our offices, when can we get back to our offices, when can we do these things? And we said, we're going to close the university for a week. We're closing it for all students, we're closing all assessment. We will communicate with you on a daily basis at these times, what it is, but please focus now on yourselves. Do the things that are important to you. And we will come back with clarity, but for a week, we are 100% closed. It was different from other institutions who said, well, we don't know, and because we don't know, we can't say anything. But that gave people the space to deal with the things that are important for them. We probably closed it for slightly longer than was needed, but ultimately that was the right thing because that gave people, again, security and foundation. And I think of that as a metaphor for when it comes to people who are doing extraordinary research or trying to innovate their teaching or trying to do other things. We say, we've got your back. We will give you as much clarity as we possibly can. We will hold the uncertainty as much as we can at the top of the organization. And with that, we hope you can go and do the extraordinary things that disproportionately will lift us as an institution. And acknowledge that sometimes things are failures, but that's okay. That's what university should be about. So that's a philosophy which I think I have seen and developed over multiple institutions and seen manifest in different ways, but I think is important to remember as a leader. You are here to serve the institution. You're here not to control it and not to manage it. You're here ultimately to empower it.
There would be very few vice-chancellors or provosts that would have had that experience, particularly with the rats, the snakes, and the cadavers. That's a great story. Thank you for sharing that. And I did my PhD at UQ and had my first academic appointment at UQ and then went to Griffith and then moved to Sydney. But I do remember those floods, and they were devastating.
Mm.
And it also speaks to both the leader's resilience, the leader's ability to work with people, but also come up with solutions that are people-focused rather than just crisis-focused.
Yes, 100%. Now, I often think that as a leader, the most important currency you have, and there's lots of currencies, I'm not saying it's the only one, but you have to be able to generate trust. And it's not just trust that people believe what you say or people believe you're going to do what you do. I've never seen any situation of high trust which is one way. You have to be able to trust, and people have to feel that they're being trusted. And it's a hard thing to do sometimes at the top of an organization because things go wrong every day. Every day there is something which goes wrong. And it's really easy to get down into the bureaucracy and say, I'm going to find a bureaucratic solution to this, and I'm going to find a way of stopping that in the future. But you have to realize that actually for the vast majority of staff and students, they're here to do extraordinary things for the right reasons. And sometimes you can if you don't trust and you end up in that kind of micromanagement bureaucratic space, there's a huge cost which goes unseen. And so that sort of people-based focus, that sense of empowering and trusting people, I think is really important. And then if you can do that, and again, I'm not saying it's easy, but I think it's important, then you get to live in this world where there are these enormous array of really eclectic, diverse personalities and views. Sometimes those come into conflict and you got to be able to lean into that. But it's such an exciting space to be. It's such an exciting. And, one of the great privileges, and I feel slightly embarrassed and indulged to say this as a Vice-Chancellor, is I get to turn up into almost anywhere in the university and ask really dumb questions, and people indulge me and give me really interesting answers. And that's a wonderful thing to do, and it's a wonderful part of my job.
But that availability and that presence, they get as much out of it as you do, because recognition from the boss, interest by the boss, is a great currency to build that trust that you mentioned earlier.
Yeah. Well, they're very kind and generous with this. It's when I was, this is perhaps an overshare, but here we go. When I was in primary school, one of my teachers wrote on my reports once that despite showing exceptional ability at times, I was far too often overwhelmed by my own enthusiasm. And she tied me to my chair at one point because she was so sick of me asking questions. And
Curious child.
Yeah. I can understand the challenge now, but certainly as a teenager, maybe even as an undergraduate, that sort of intrinsic interest that I have in things sat more awkwardly with me, and it is it has been a wonderful part of my career and professional journey in universities, to again be able to sort of reconnect with that interest and to be part of a community which has so many different views.
If we could return to students,
yeah,
what are the comments that students say about their experience at your university? What do they say about the university? What do they say about their courses?
Yeah, hard to talk for the whole student body, because as you know, they're diverse and they have different views. And I think, as you've already talked about, post-COVID, there's a generation who have had, quite a big part of their schooling disrupted in quite a profound way. And so some of them are looking to reconnect, looking for how they can find their place of belonging. And it's something that we're doing very proactively and thinking about very carefully. That kind of, when I was an undergraduate, and I don't know if it was the same for you, Judith, but we went to the lectures and we thought the lectures were the main event, and the arguments in the pub afterwards or the were sort of, yes, they were collateral benefit, but they weren't the main thing. And so now I think that sense of reconnecting and being part of a community is actually much more the main thing. And all the evidence shows that people who do feel they have connections and do feel they belong actually do academically much, much better. So I was at a student function, actually it was towards the end of last year, and I was asking, these were first year students, what their experience had been. And I expected them to talk a bit more about their disciplines. This comes back to our earlier point. But, I remember talking to one young woman and she said to me, I came to university because I wanted to meet interesting people and make some new friends. And I've done that this year and it's been great. Mm-hmm. And by the way, post-colonial New Zealand history has absolutely captured my imagination in ways that I never thought. And I actually think that was sort of the right positioning of the proverbial chicken and the proverbial egg in that space. So that's what is an experience I think we aspire for all of our students. Post-COVID, we're going to have to continue and work hard to find ways of engaging and connecting with them. And we're now, as we move through that pipeline, we're seeing students who had that educational disruption at earlier stages. I do want to move them beyond that kind of box-ticking mentality where they just atomize information, learn it, regurgitate it in curriculum, and then move it on. So move into that sort of synthesis mode as early as we can. But we are moving in that direction, and so far across the curriculum, the feedback so far has been positive, but we have more work to do in that area.
If we could fast forward 2 years and we're having another conversation, what do you think we'd be talking about reimagining higher education?
Reimagining higher education, I think across the sector.
Yep.
I think AI is going to be even more fundamental than it is now. ChatGPT is at the absolutely amoebic stage of its evolution. And I think the questions around to what degree we are shaping the use of digital technology and the degree to which it's shaping us are really important. And 2 years further on, I think we'll have some interesting reflections on what that looks like and interesting reflections on how much we've leaned into that space. I think if we're focusing in New Zealand, we may also be talking about a tension which is emerging and between, and it's a tension I've seen it many times. When I was at the University of Oxford, my college governing body used to line up with all the humanities scholars on one side of the table and all the physical sciences on the other side of the table, which was just so disappointing. But we're seeing that in our political rhetoric now, this idea that technology and physical and hard sciences are the places where that's going to drive business, that's going to drive innovation, that's the thing that we need to invest in. And in my own view, that's short-sighted. And I say this as a physical scientist. Even including the Industrial Revolution, I think technology is changing our lives more quickly than it ever has. But it means we're moving really quickly. But where we're going, what the direction is that we're taking, how we are thinking about what it is that's important to us, those sort of destination-focused questions are the domain of the humanities. And if we lose that connection and lose that input, then I think we are in very, very perilous straits. So we might be talking about that. I hope we're going to be talking about the sort of post-COVID recovery and the synthesis and that idea of those high-level skills. And I hope we're also going to be talking about how universities, and certainly my university, has continued to reclaim that space for productive, interesting ideological conflict. The place where we talk about things that aren't being talked about anywhere else because we have the evidence and intellectual training and fundamental respect for each other to talk about things which are really difficult. And that, whether that in New Zealand, sometimes that's our role in Te Tiriti o Waitangi, sometimes it's in, gender identity. Sometimes it's in sort of, current geopolitical challenges, whether that's the Middle East or other spaces. But I hope we're talking about how universities have reclaimed that space and in doing so reconnected with the relevance that we talked about at the beginning of this conversation.
I've got 3 more questions. First one is, what advice would you give to your younger self?
I might have already covered this, but to not worry so much about the asking questions, not worry so much about not engaging in the opportunities to learn. Ultimately, those are things which have driven my career, and those are things which have been most exciting. And as I said, as an undergraduate, perhaps that fundamental enthusiasm for learning, at least the how people perceived it, sat more uncomfortably with me then than it does now. A few years ago, we were signing off. This is when I was Dean of Engineering at the University of Auckland, the biggest building project that the university had undertaken at that point in time. It was just north of $300 million. And we sat in this meeting, and the head architect said, "I'm going to take the memo as read so we can just get to the details," and then started to talk in quite excruciating detail about a number of different elements to it. And the Vice-Chancellor was there, the Chancellor was there, council members were there, and I was there as the project sponsor. I didn't have the memo. I hadn't read the memo. I spent a few minutes looking for the memo on my laptop, and then I emailed my office to say, is there a memo? Can you send it to me? In the hope that I could sort of catch up on the conversation. And after about 10 minutes, I finally decided that the only thing I could do was to actually put my hand up and say, look, I haven't read the memo. I'm sorry, I can't follow anything you're saying. Which I took a deep breath and wondered if this was going to be a career limiting move for me or not. Put my hand up and said, look, I don't have the memo. And then the Chancellor said, well, I don't have the memo either. And the Vice-Chancellor said, they didn't have the memo. It turned out no one had the memo because they'd never sent the memo. And so in many ways, that was doing a service to the whole group. Ignorance is valuable because when you lose it, you never get it back. And sometimes if I don't understand, it's my role as a leader to say so. It's my role to be brave and to say so, because perhaps it's a service for me, perhaps it's a service for them. But to go forward trying to feign understanding, I think, is a road to all kinds of difficulties. So my advice would be to stop worrying so much and just get on with it. And if you look like an idiot, then some of the time, then hopefully that balances out in the long run.
We've all been to many, many graduations. It's a time of absolute delight and joy, and it always amazes me how nervous students are walking across the stage to receive their testimony. What advice would you give to students on graduation?
Yeah, it's one of those experiences where there's a real sort of asymmetry. We as experienced academics get to sit on stage and we get to enjoy it every time, whereas for them, they're only doing it this once. Be brave. As I've said probably 3 or 4 times now, ask lots of questions if you don't understand, but also stay connected to your community. I have friends from university and all my university experiences, which are so far outside people I otherwise would have met. The diversity of university communities is kind of unique in most people's professional lives. And stay connected to those systems, stay connected to those people, because they will, as you get older, open up an incredibly rich array of doors and ways of seeing things that you might not otherwise had. So yeah, that would be my advice. I would be less concerned about specific technical competence and disciplines, as we've said, and more focused on the social connections and the kinds of ways in which you can see the world differently because of what you've done.
And my last question is a little bit off kilter. We've had the summer break. What have you been reading?
I've been reading, it comes back to our AI, Ethan Mollick's Co-Intelligence, which is at one end quite a practical view of how AI could be changing our lives. In another sense, much more a sort of philosophical question of what it means to be human. How are we going to evolve or co-evolve? What's going to happen when we exceed what we think of as human intelligence in AI systems? How do we align the intent of AI with our own intent? And I suppose what it is ultimately reinforced, which is some of the things I've already talked about today, is that these questions are far less about the technology. They're certainly not about the computing or the mathematics. They're about the underpinning philosophy and humanity of who we are and what's important for us. So it's been an interesting question. It's a very accessible book. I've enjoyed it a lot.
Nic, thank you for the 47 minutes that you've given me today. I have just delighted in our conversation. I hope you've enjoyed it as much as I have. And I hope sometime, perhaps at Universities Australia or something, we meet face to face.
Right, that would be wonderful, Judyth. And I really appreciate both the opportunity and the questions and the conversation as well. Thank you for your time.
You have been listening to Studiosity's podcast, Reimagining Higher Education, candid conversations within higher education, sharing stories of leadership, change, and best practice in teaching and learning. Visit studiosity.com.